Thing to see was research group summary meeting. Just to remind people, this is an IETF meeting. The IPR guidelines of the IETF apply, which, by the way, are essentially the same ones the IETF uses. So if you talk about technology and know that technology has a patent claim, you need to be telling us, or maybe you don't want to talk about the technology if you can't. I would have expected to find some pink sheets here. I don't. So can I ask somebody who has paper to generate one for circulating it? Who has paper? Nobody has paper anymore in 2015. Jaime is doing that? No, that doesn't work. Yeah, make 2 columns, name and organization. Thank you. Okay, so I need a couple of note takers. I'm assuming we have an Alex. I'm assuming we have an Etherpad for that. I haven't actually checked that. Ah, yeah, you can use the clipboard, of course. Thank you. We have a Jabber channel, just in case. Can anyone join the Jabber? Ari is going to do that. Thank you. And just as a reminder, there is a mailing list. This mailing list is T2TRG@IETF.org. Remember that when you subscribe to the mailing list, there is an IETF. There's still lots of confusion between IETF and IETF here. So last time I looked, this was the place to actually subscribe. And we also have had some recent trouble with the mailing list. So if something is strange about the mailing list, please tell me. It should be working by now, but if something doesn't work the way you think it should, please tell me. We also have a GitHub organization, and the repository for this meeting is up there. GitHub T2TRG-2015-IETF94. And that should contain all the materials from the weekend meeting and also the slides for today. The slides for today are also on the meeting materials manager. So if you're used to looking there, then you can find them there. There has been some agenda bashing already in the time between when I came here and now. So the idea is that we will spend a little more than half an hour with a summary of the weekend meeting and with an overview of the research group and a summary of the weekend meeting, and then have 20 minutes of chartering discussion. Now, in case we don't need all that time, there was one talk that was pushed off the weekend agenda because people couldn't make it. And if possible at the end, I would like to include that talk, but we will see how far we get with the time. Any other things we should have on the agenda? Okay, so let's quickly recap what the Think to Think research group is. Who was at the summary meeting in Prague? Okay, so that's only about a third of the people who are there. So I will have to go into a little bit of detail here. So the idea about the proposed Think to Think research group is that the Internet of Things is coming, and there are a lot of research issues that we want to examine on the way to creating a true Internet of Things. So an internet where low resource nodes with limited battery user interfaces, maybe processing capabilities, can communicate among themselves and with the wider internet. And we have the ability for permissionless innovation. So that's a very broad topic. And of course, we are focusing this on areas where it actually makes sense that we are closely associated with the IETF. So areas where we would expect future standardization to be of importance, those are really the things we want to focus on. And that means we probably won't look at specific radio technologies or something like that, or battery technologies. We will start at the adaptation layer and end at the application layer, including architectures and APIs for communicating and data and management functions. That also includes security. So that's the area we want to cover here. One interesting development is that in the W3C, something has been going on that is a bit mirroring what we are doing here. The W3C has so-called interest groups, which are working groups that haven't quite formed yet, and that try to generate overview documents. And an interest group for the Web of Things has been created in the W3C this year. And they are kind of a natural partner at the application layer. They're probably not so interested in adaptation layer issues, but at the application layer, they are interesting people to talk to. And that is actually just an example of what's going on out there. We now have a first wave of IoT standards completed by the IETF. And out there are lots of organizations that want to build systems on top of these standards. And this causes new requirements for research. So we are no longer looking at small pieces of technology. We are looking at the big picture and how can we actually make use of the standards we have now, and what are the gaps that need to be filled, and what can we prepare for standardization before an actual IETF working group works on this. So to get a little bit more detail into this picture, one area that is of interest is why are we having this highly siloed situation out there in the early Internet of Things proposals and the early devices you can buy. Of course, there are commercial reasons for doing that, but there may also be technical obstacles that we can actually look at and find out how to get them out of the way or work around them. And the idea is that in the end, it will be possible to talk from a thing to a thing just as well as it is possible to talk from a thing to the cloud, and that this will allow scaling applications in a single network. So you don't have single application networks. Generally, there are deployment considerations. Scaling is probably the most important word in the Internet of Things, not just scaling up, but as importantly, scaling down, so we can use many inexpensive devices. Management and operation are issues. So far, we haven't really looked at management per se, but we have looked at what protocols we might be using for actually getting existing management frameworks to work in the Internet of Things. Lifecycle aspects are very important. If a thing is acquired, then most likely that will have a certain life cycle. When you are done with it, you cannot just delete it, it's still there. And we need to find out how to handle that life cycle. And there are always security considerations around that as well. And finally, in particular in cooperation with W3C, data formats, semantics, and so on will need to be worked on. Clearly, that is something where lots of organizations are actually working on, but there may be some IETF specific aspects here that we may want to focus on. Areas of interest where we don't quite know what we will be doing here, but which might become interesting. One aspect is things often have more complicated relationships to the humans and the organizations out there than a data file. A data file is typically in the hands of a single organization. A thing might be owned by someone, might be used by someone else, might actually collect data that is personally identifiable information of a third stakeholder and so on. So the situation around things can get more complicated, or it's likely to get more complicated than around data objects. Those that have followed the development of Internet of Things applications protocols in the last couple of years will have noticed that we have two camps there. One is looking at web-based approaches, representational state transfer. So our main keyword is state, and other people are looking at message-based approaches, and the keyword there is events. And if you look a little bit closer, you will find out that states and events are in the same kind of duality in which particles and waves are when you look at light. So when you look at something for a second, it may look like an event, but if you look for a little longer, it may suddenly look like a state, or vice versa. So that's something we want to explore, which we are already doing a little bit, but that's an interesting question. Distribution of processing, keywords like fog computing, scalability considerations there. How do you work in an environment where there are lots of resources, but you cannot really rely on all of these resources? There should be something that rings home for people who are working on the internet, and similar considerations apply to the computing resources. And finally, how do you actually apply the trend of containerization and mobile code to very, very simple, basic devices? So these are the areas of interest. And to do this, to work on these, we probably have a few more objectives. One is the definition of benchmarks or reference environments. It's always very hard to talk about someone, to talk with someone about performance considerations, because the scenario they have in mind is probably completely different than the scenario you already have. So it is probably useful to have some reference environments that, for instance, will allow us to run plugfests. So we all have a common scenario we are working on when plugging things together and testing our protocols, but also as a basis for repeatable research, because if you have a benchmark environment, then you might be able to say something, this is 30% faster than that other approach, or uses 30% less memory. And that's hard to do if you don't have a benchmark. It might be useful to simply describe applications running in the Internet of Things. So what actually has worked and what are the characteristics that made it work. We probably need terms, we need survey documents, and after a while probably best practice documents. And finally, the objective is to work with industry fora, not in the meaning of a formal liaison relationship or something like that, but just making sure their relevant information gets known here and our relevant information gets known there. Obviously, we also have a relationship to the IETF working groups. There are currently 8 working groups in the IETF working on Internet of Things issues, focusing on Internet of Things issues, I should say, and probably a couple more that also are highly interesting to us. And of course, the job of the research group is not to replicate what's going on there. All the normative work, of course, goes on in working groups. But we want to know what's going on there. We want to make sure they have information that we possibly already have acquired in some form. And in the long run, we might actually generate things, not those things, but other things that might spawn new working groups as well. So for this, one interesting consideration is that maybe doing something like a use case document can be done in parallel with actually chartering a working group. So when the working group actually hits the ground, it already has a document to look at for use cases or other informational references, surveys, and so on. Yeah, and there's also an IoT directorate. This is a little bit running on the back burner right now, but it's definitely an environment that we want to talk to. The IAB is very important for us. There have been 2 seminal workshops run by the IAB or by IAB people that really have shaped the work in the last half decade in the IETF on the Internet of Things, the Smart Object Workshop in Prague, and the Smart Object Security Workshop in Paris. These have been very useful, and I would expect additional workshops like this to happen, in particular in areas that are kind of related to our work. So for instance, there's going to be a workshop on semantic interoperability early next year, and that's certainly something where we want to cooperate. Explaining the name, I sometimes get asked, this research group is called Thing to Thing. So you are not interested in Thing to Cloud architectures? That's of course not the point here. Actually, Thing to Thing came up as an homage to the end-to-end research group that has been working on a number of subjects for a long time. And we are not excluding device-to-cloud models. To the contrary, of course, things work best if they also have bigger companions to talk to. But of course, also the ability to talk to thing and not just device to cloud is an important aspect of a real Internet of Things. And now that I have named the end-to-end research group, I probably have to say, of course, this will be an open membership research group. I'm not even aware of a new closed membership research group having been created recently. So this will operate a lot like the other research groups that you're familiar with. And I'm not going to cite all those research groups that we can learn a lot from Things like regular plug tests and so on, maybe common open source software that we're looking at and so on. That's something that we can learn from other research groups. The proposed research group has already met a couple of times before. So we had our first meeting in Dallas with IETF92, where we identified 3 main areas of internet: REST, management protocols, and security. And in Prague, we kind of focused on REST and security, not ignoring management protocols, but just considering management protocols another application in the area of applied REST. And Prague also was our first joint meeting with W3C interest group Web of Things that had just before had their first face-to-face meeting in Munich. And in this meeting, we had another joint meeting with the interest group Web of Things. The interest group already had met in Sapporo last week, and we took a lot of input from there. And again, we essentially split into 2 tracks. One track that we have been calling REST as we know it, but that might turn into a beyond REST activity over time. And the other one about security and lifecycle aspects in constrained node networks. So again, since this is a joint meeting, we were focusing on joint discussion. Maybe when we have a few meetings that are not joint meetings, we will be having additional focuses that are beyond those of W3C. But right now, this seems a very natural partnership, and we have very similar ideas of the gaps that need to be addressed right now. Okay, and yeah, this is actually a meeting where we want to do a little bit of administrative work as well at the end of this summary meeting. The agenda was pretty much split between talks. I didn't count them, but we had approximately 10 talks by different researchers and breakouts where we were progressing these 2 tracks, A and B. And let me talk about those tracks. The RESTful track, or the track A, has since identified 2 deliverables they want to work on. The first one is often called a cookbook. So it's meant as a guidance document. So we have terminology, basic guidance, pointers to other work that needs to be considered in one document, and that will grow with information about design patterns, resource design. How do you actually shape the resources that you put up in a thing server? Yeah, we have a document that we are working with. That's a very first version, but it already has been able to serve as a basis for very useful discussions. The other document, I'll come back to that in a minute, really right now is more or less a scenario document. It describes ways to develop and test a hypertext or hypermedia driven approach. And we will develop this by actually running plug fests, or plug rests as we have called them, where we actually build these systems and try to collect information from this actual building. So for a while, this deliverable will go on as a number of Plugfest activities. And of course, while we are doing this, the document will grow and document what we have learned. So again, this track is very close with W3C. There are 3 task forces in the WOT interest group called thing description, discovery, and API and protocols. We're interacting with all 3. Right now, thing description is the one where we have the strongest ideas how to run the next Plugfest. And the idea is to do this as a very cooperative activity, sharing experiences, sharing code. We both have open development methodologies, so we both live on GitHub essentially, and so we can openly exchange information. And there are wiki documents by the interest group task forces that we can make use of and that will turn into W3C documents soon. So the next concrete touch point is planned for late January, last week in January, where we might have a joint Plugfest in conjunction with the next W3C Web of Things meeting, and that is currently scheduled for southern France. Yeah, so just to give you an idea of what this is about, there are terms like application state that really have to be looked at closely when you talk about distributed systems with many things in them. You have, in REST you have state, but of course we also have actions. And how do you model actions with REST? How do you links? How do you represent values there? How do we do partial changes on resources? The term collections is coming up about every 5 seconds, in particular also when we talk about management. And the conclusions are we think we know how to do this, but it would be much better if we had done it once and had documented our experience. So there are lots of components which we think all work, but building systems with that is an activity that actually still is research. And the idea is to learn from specific scenarios. So this draft here is one of the scenarios, and it's a simple application level design where these design styles have been applied to a basic lighting scenario. And the idea is to make that, use that as a basis for the plug rests. In track B, we are also influenced by what W3C does. In the interest, apart from the 3 task forces that I mentioned, there is an interest group on security, privacy, and resilience. They are trying to add safety to that list, because when you do things, then you probably have to think about safety as well. And they have ongoing work on challenges or gaps, requirements, and in particular on a landscape of means, which means they are surveying what tools are there already in our toolkit. And there are lots of tools in our toolkit, and we need to, since there's almost nobody who knows all these security technologies, we need a little bit more information about what their characteristics are and what problems they can solve and where the gaps are. So this is very useful work, and I think there will be a lot of cross-pollination. For the research group side, we have identified 2 documents that we really would like to work on now. One everybody who has followed the work of the core working group probably is aware about this document. It's a document that we have been working on a little bit in the core working group, but the core working group always had this design work to do and had to get out standards and so on. So maybe it wasn't the right environment to move this forward. So in the research group, we have identified a number of people who want to work on this. Of course, this is not a closed list, but having names here makes sure that we actually do have the energy for working on this. So the title is Security Considerations for the Internet of Things. That, of course, could become a quite sizable book. We want to focus on the main message here. So there may be some appendices maybe with additional information, but the idea is that we at least cover issues like life cycle, ownership, stakeholders, but also it's interesting that in the recent IoT documents, there have been ISG comments on the security considerations that show that we do have gaps there. And addressing these gaps is probably also a quite useful thing because it allows IETF documents to reference, when we're done, it allows IETF documents to reference this document, so they don't necessarily need a lot of verbiage about security considerations that are global to the IoT domain and not specific to the document there. So this is a well-prepared document that essentially just needs to be picked up and infused with new energy. The other deliverable we have in mind is a little bit, yes?
One clarifying question on that. Do you consider that document a product of this research group that's being formed? Okay, so it's being referenced by mandatory security sections in IETF documents, but it's produced by the research group.
Well, security consideration sections in standards typically don't contain RFC 2119 language.
Okay.
So it's not meant to solve problems. It's meant to indicate problems and to give some guidance how certain problems can be avoided. So it's really security considerations. A more ambitious deliverable is this one. We don't have a document that is quite as well developed already here, but we think it would be very useful to have a little bit of a survey of security bootstrapping approaches, because there is a large number of these approaches out there, and surveying them, identifying their characteristics, maybe grouping them into categories would be a very good basis for the next steps that will happen in the IETF, where we will actually have bootstrapping operations in the protocols. So right now, the protocols that are being worked on don't have bootstrapping functions, but I'm sure they will grow them over time, and it would be good to have this document. So this is a bit more risky, and we also don't have quite as many people who want to work on this. So if you are interested in working on this, but that's also true for this document, of course, please come up because this is really useful work for the IETF to work on. Okay, so these are essentially the 4 deliverables we want to work on near term. Of course, we could do 100 other things, but we only have a certain amount of energy. And the plans forward include going to that joint meeting with W3C in France in the week from January 25th. That seems like a pretty good idea. Then we don't have a very solid idea what we will do in the spring. Probably we will contribute to that IAB workshop on semantic interoperability, but that hasn't been quite nailed down yet, as far as I understand. There is also a W3C meeting that we might somehow try to be involved with. Then maybe the next condensation kernel here is the July IETF. And in August, we should be trying to get a workshop at a major research conference. But that, of course, depends on whether the proposal is accepted. And that is the meeting planning we have in mind so far. But of course, we are flexible, except maybe for this January thing, which seems to be pretty much set now. Questions on the summary?
Kevin Fall, CMU. So in one of your first slides where you define things, it's constrained nodes, constrained sort of communication in those environments. And maybe this ship has sailed already given all the previous work, but you did use the word safety in your discussion there. And there's a whole category of things, right, that we might call industrial internet or other sorts of things that are not necessarily communication constrained, or at least they're not node constrained, but may have real-time timing requirements, may have sort of special security requirements, proofs for control loops, that kind of thing. In the RG charter, that did not appear in your sketch, I think, to be present. Will it be?
Well, that certainly can be fleshed out. I think the idea here is to think about architecture that can include constrained objects and constrained networks. But that doesn't mean that all the elements of that architecture are constrained. But we don't want to do another car-to-car research group. So I think the thingness is the important element here.
Right, I'm just, I guess, trying to establish what your definition for thingness is. Because there was pre-existing notion of thing that appeared to equate with constrained capabilities on the nodes. I'm trying to figure out if that's really what you want it to be.
No, I think, again, the point is, if you want to be able to scale, then at least some of these things will be constrained. And it would be nice if they could be part of the picture. Okay. But of course, a server rack also is a thing. That's a good point, Kevin. So we will reread the charter based on that comment. That's useful.
Hi, I'm Andrew Sullivan. So now I'm confused. Well, no, now I'm confused about a different thing. So it sounded to me like what Kevin was asking was, okay, well, you've got this this definition of thing that seems to have, constrained something in it, and now we just said, well, okay, but it's true that there are these things that aren't constrained. So now it seems like what we're talking about is networking, and that doesn't seem a good answer either. So we're going to have to, like, it seems actually that this is a really fundamental question about the scope of this research group and whether it can actually succeed. So, I mean, is that the point that you're trying to make?
So Kevin Fall again. Not that I'm trying to advise you one way or the other, but I lived through a world in a 2000 era, which we called sensor networks, where the premise, right, was constrained nodes. And as 1 year would go to the next, they became less and less constrained. Nonetheless, all sorts of interesting work came out of that. And we have Census, which might be the place you want to connect with and so on. But I guess I want to make clear that if your choice is that the constrainedness is the primary thing you're going to focus on, that's going to lead you down a certain set of paths. Whereas the real time and control loop and all of that stuff, you might say the inverse of DT and RG in some ways, would admit a different set of work potentially. And so just wanted to bring that, it worries me a little bit if thing equals constrained node.
Well, the constraintness is not just in the amount of transistors that are in the silicon. There are other constraints, like the thing doesn't have human attention. The thing is somehow remote and cannot be constantly handled in some form.
Doesn't have continuous connectivity, for example?
Yes.
Okay.
But I mean, of course, we are aware of what DT Energy did, so we're not going to try to repeat that.
It gives me, since I start from a naturally confused state, it's not like there's a whole lot to do there. But it's Andrew again, by the way, for the remotes. It seems to me, though, that now we really are in risk of making the scope of this research group such that it's going to have a hard time focusing. So it would be valuable, it seems to me, to either to say, okay, well, we've got these categories of things, and you've sort of got to identify which thing you're trying to work on in order to bound the work. Because it can't possibly be right that this research group is supposed to study on networking of anything that is constrained in some respect. I mean, you know, I am constrained in space and time, for instance, and so we're really that's really an enormous scope, and I'm worried about the potential for a lot of different kinds of research, such that the researchers who are interested in a common topic end up coming here and finding a lot of other people who are interested in completely different topics. That's really my only worry.
Colin Jennings. I certainly agree that some things are constrained, but I think that many of the problems that are most interesting to me are specific research problems that have to do with devices that I think of as things, because we cannot use them and manage the user interfaces and inputs to them that we do with most networking equipment. So like the security provisioning, bootstrapping, enrollment type problem, that's a very specific problem. It doesn't matter whether the thing, that problem exists for both constrained, non-constrained things. Many of the devices that are actually being sold in this space right now, like I'm involved with a power meter that goes for $700 each. I mean, the number of transistors in it is not really an issue in that sort of space, but it still has that bootstrapping and provisioning problem. So when I read the charter, it seemed to me that it covered every research problem that had ever impacted maybe anything that happened at IETF. Like, it was very, very broad. So I'd prefer us to, but when you go and when you're talking about specific 4 areas to look at, those seem much narrower. Like, we could say, here's a particular research question. So I'd rather see a charter that had a set of specific research, fairly narrow questions that said what they were going to address and try and do. And we evolve it over time, but something fairly specific, not just something that covers everything that we might ever do. And I think that would help address Andrew's problem too, of get us to some specific points.
Lars Eggert. So I want to push back on the last 2 points a little bit, because in the IETF, we actually try and have, so the charters in the IETF fulfill a very different goal than the charters in the IETF, right? They're much more, I said this earlier this week, they're much more advertisements to researchers to understand whether their research will fit in this group. And think of it almost like a call for paper or something. And yeah, if the call for paper says, everything in networking is in scope, that is too broad. And I think that we wanna look at. But otherwise, I wouldn't want to have something that is very tightly constrained, because we are supposed to be open, and we in the IETF often rely on the chairs of the groups to give it a focus at any given time and make sure that the work isn't all over the place. And in some research group that works better, and then in others, the chairs maybe don't put the time in, and it is a little bit all over the place, but that's a different problem. Yes, we should take a look at the charter text to make sure if we can constrain it more. I think that's useful, but I wouldn't want to have something that is very limited and we have to recharter them in 6 months. That's really not sort of how the IETF normally operates. I think look at Congestion Control Research Group. I don't think their charter has ever changed in 20 years, and everybody sort of kind of gets what they're doing, and it changes over time, and that's fine.
It's Andrew again. So I agree with everything you just said. I'm not trying to say like, you know, get yourself milestones and that sort of thing. That's not my goal. But we've seen research groups, right, that have scope that is too broad for people to focus, because you know they end up spending a lot of time arguing amongst themselves about what is the real problem that we ought to be working on, and I just don't think that's an interesting thing for the research group to do. That's what I'm worried about.
Correct. So in the IETF, right, we the ADs and the chairs oftentimes use the charter, and we use it to be very descriptive, so that we can eliminate a lot of arguments with people that want to put their work in where it really shouldn't be in that because it's trying to do something else. But in the IETF, we rely more on the chairs to explain to people that come and, you know, how does this fit, and say, yes, it does fit the general, you know, the general umbrella of work, right? It is IoT related, but at the moment, this group really is mostly focused on this, and so you might not, you know, receive the attention that you want to have when you bring it here. But it's more of that the chairs matter, in my opinion, way more in the IETF than in the IETF.
So again, I agree, and I guess what I'm trying to really, I only got up because of what Kevin said, and what I heard in response was, "Oh yes, that's a problem here too."
You can't get up anymore, Kevin.
Oh yes, that's a problem here too, and that seemed to me to be like, you know, at least 90 degrees away from the first thing that I thought we were working on. So we should probably have some agreement at least about what are the interesting problems. I don't care how we get it.
So the current charter text contains, the current proposed charter text contains the items that have been here on the slides. I'm almost a little bit unsure whether we should have that detail in the charter. So I'm a little bit more on the other side of that argument. Kevin.
So Kevin Fall again. So now I will make a slight advocation. Before I was just making the observation. So based on, I can't get up again, right? This idea that these are advertisements for whether researchers might be interested is to the point. In fact, what I really want to know is if I got somebody who's doing real-time controller research using internet protocols, do they go here or not? Because the first line of the charter says constrained nodes.
So you want that to be in the second line, or?
Personally, I'd prefer it not to be one, but I would, other than this is one of the areas potentially. So, I mean, if it was my choice, I would probably say things include devices coupled to physical systems that may be constrained, that we know about in a decade's or 15-ish years worth of SensorNet research reference. That's probably how I'd do it.
Well, I can certainly live with that. I'm not sure that the IETF is the place where we want to do real-time control work. We have just
Who's better?
Pardon me?
Who's better?
We have just chartered a working group called DetNet, so that's yes. So we are doing this kind of.
But there are research questions too, right?
Yes.
So that was my opinion.
So I don't really want to monopolize that discussion. There are other people in the research group that maybe have an idea of how we should focus that.
I have one question. So you mentioned this internal collaboration with other research group like ICNRG. You have any concrete plan? From my knowledge, that group is working on specifically. Some people mentioned this. The issues with, for example, like a naming, like a security associated with naming and the data forwarding associated with naming, whatever this type of thing. Eventually, this group is going to hit. So that's.
Well, ICNRG is trying to solve a problem that is very much related to that problem that we call beyond rest. this year we have managed to always put our research group meetings on top of IC Energy meetings, so we didn't quite have the amount of exchange that I hope we will have in the future. But yes, I agree that the ICN work is very relevant to the work that we are doing.
Yeah, Jörg, I do like the idea of keeping this scope a bit more on the open side, and I agree with Lars' suggestion that it's a bit up to the chair to figure out how to focus things. And I mean, at the end of the day, this is contribution driven, and if you're suddenly going to get a gazillion requests on that involve real-time control of devices attached to monstrous things that move other things that weigh tons, then that is probably a valuable input to the community, and we may learn something from by looking at bits and pieces from angles that we haven't thought about before. And so I would see this as a useful catalyst function that a research group could bring. It should be inclusive rather than excluding people.
Arkirainen, as someone who has been participating in the last few meetings, I think we had pretty open scope to begin with, and we were discussing quite a lot, and then quite naturally two different tracks emerged. We had the security track and the RESTful track, and then we were focused within those groups, within those topics. And I think that model worked pretty well so far. So I would also perhaps lean more on towards the open side and see how things evolve and play it from there.
Yeah, but I agree that maybe we can make the pardon? Yes, but I agree that we probably can make the link to physical systems a little bit more visible in that charter.
Matthias Kovac, ETH Zurich. So maybe to give some input from someone who was active in this research group or the meetings we had so far. For me, this was actually quite clear what the goal is of this research group. So my background actually started in wireless sensor networks, then moved on to this kind of Internet of Things, cyber physical systems. And the idea there is to have these kind of things, so devices that are attached to something physical, and try to apply internet technology there and to solve it on a very broad and interconnected and interoperable way. And I liked actually this definition that it's something connected to something physical and it may be constrained. And so it could be these kind of real-time controllers. However, we won't discuss what's the best way to do real-time control there, but kind of discuss how this affects the protocols and the networking that is involved there. So usually we look at architectures that involve these different kind of things and they should work together. So someone could work on this, give us some input. This is definitely interesting for the architecture, but he won't find that many people who can advise or where ideas on real-time control can be exchanged. The same is if you have use cases from some specific application domains. That's not really what we want to work on, but it's kind of this architecture that can unify these kind of different systems.
I think these are good keywords, architecture and unify. Any other comments?
Lars, I don't know if you said this in the beginning. So I think the group's been very active. The group's been very good. So I will take chartering forward with the IAB and let me know when you have text that you think addresses the comment you've gotten, and I expect it to be chartered soon.
Thank you. So I'm afraid we won't have time for the talk that's spilled over from the weekend meeting. Sorry about that. And thank you all for coming.
He's right here or here.